Hey, Thomas. Okay. Ping the channel. Hey, Sergey. Okie dokie, just ping the channel. I think Janae is coming at least, and hopefully a few more. Cool. All right, Sandy's here. Let me, actually, I gotta share my screen first so I can pull you guys over here. How's everybody doing today? Can you guys hear me? Okay, doing all right. Good. So we'll kind of dive right in. Basically, like the purpose of today is literally just to talk through the project requirements. We've kind of found as a team that there is a lot of confusion around the way that the project requirements are expressed for this project in particular. So our goal is just to go through each one of those, clarify any questions that you have, maybe give some examples. And kind of go from there, right? So it'll be a little bit lighter in that sense, but if we get done early, we can talk about whatever you guys want to, or we can call it a night, whatever you guys want to do. Cool, right? So we're just gonna get started. All right, so if we look at the project page, a lot of this is the same elements as you'd seen in previous project pages. So we're gonna start off kind of in the actual requirement pieces. Although the first thing I kind of want to touch on is that, like, in terms of what your app is on the whole, it's still just letting you CRUD some things. It's a content management system. So you're letting users keep track of something in particular, right? I find that stressing that to students eases them a little bit, because it's not necessarily like you're trying to build the next Facebook. You're just trying to build something that is very similar in ways to your Mod 2 project. So it's not that different. There are just some more stringent requirements. Let's talk this requirement first, right? This is written in a way that might imply to you that you need a lot more going on in your application than you really do. It's not written in a way that's clear, right? What they're getting at here is that they are looking in particular for a many-to-many relationship implemented with a join table, right? So this is a lot of words just to get at that idea, right? So you could hit this requirement with 3 models and that would be fine. Although it's more typical to maybe have 4 or 5, right? Not that you need all of those, right? But basically, I think I have it here because I was talking about this with some of you in pod, right? They're just looking to see that you have a many-to-many with 2 has many throughs, right? And really the reason that they're getting at that is because they really care about this join table, right? So it's a lot of words just to get at this idea that they want you to have a join model where a user can submit something other than a foreign key, right? That's what they're really getting at there. So the classic example would be doctors, patients, and appointments, right? What's the join model there? Some of you have heard me say this 10 times, but yeah. Some of you could like if you had $1 for every time you've heard me say this, but we're just being super clear. But it's the appointments, right? So an appointment can have a ton of stuff that's not just a foreign key, right? It can have a date, it can have a time, it can have a location. I'm sure it can have other things as well, right? But they're looking to see that somewhere you have a form where a user is making an instance of that join table. And obviously they're not like manually putting in foreign keys, but they're submitting something about that join model, right? So that's really what they're trying to get at in too many words in this requirement, right? They're looking for that many-to-many. I feel like this week I've been swimming in conversations with many of you about like your models and your relationships. So if you haven't started your project or you're thinking about ideas, I know Nancy told her students this, it can make it easier to come up with the join model first, right? So that you're not like dancing in models and trying to figure out how they connect. So what she tells her students is you can't go wrong with some variation on a category. Like a user has some category of things that they can keep track of, and that category has other things, right? So something like a user can keep track of bucket lists, and their bucket lists have many items, right? Then you can say something like a user has many items through their bucket list, right? That would hit that requirement because you have that join model. And a lot of projects are variations on that theme, right? What is a thing that a user can keep track of? They can keep track of their orders, right? Maybe a user has many restaurants through the orders they make to those restaurants, right? That would hit that requirement in 3 models. Maybe so it's fairly common to do like a task manager app, right? A user has many tasks through a project. A user has many tasks through a list, right? That would hit those as well, right? So once you sort of get that pattern, it's not so hard to come up with ideas. And if you find, like, you will be the best to assess how much you want to stretch yourself in a project, right? But it's also okay to sometimes keep it simple and just have a project that is simple but well built. I would take that over a super complex project that is poorly built, right? Cool. What else? Kind of like the standard example, they have this in here somewhere, is like a recipe app. And many projects are some variation on that theme, right? So you might have an app that lets a user create recipes, and maybe a user has many ingredients through those recipes, right? You can apply the same thing to cocktails. You can apply the same thing to, I want to say, like playlists, right? That's a variation on the same thing, right? My project, which I've shown some of you many times, I had 4 models in this case because I had a separate join table, but I had users, I had that a user had many exercises, or sorry, workouts rather, and a workout had many exercises through workout exercises, right? So 4 models there that hits that requirement. And you could do the same thing in that case with something like a cocktail, something like a recipe, right? I think even my Sinatra project, I think I have that hanging out somewhere, right? I did like users could keep track of their skincare routines. That's really just a variation on a recipe, because I had a user, right? A user had routines, right? A routine had many products through routine products, right? And then I guess the one thing I should be stressing is like what's on the join table, right? Something like a routine product could have, where's my schema? I think I had like quantity or something of that nature. Where are we at here? Well, that, I guess I didn't hit that requirement because that was a different project, but I hit it for my Rails project. So every workout exercise had a number of sets and reps, right? Something user submittable, right? So there's actually a lot that you can do and hit this project requirement. Whereas I feel like sometimes in my discussion with you guys, it's like, it becomes a big ordeal to try to figure out how the pieces fit together. So if it's helpful and you haven't started, try to think of the join table first and then work your way out from there, right? Are there any questions in particular about that requirement? Because that's the one that tends to give students headaches, and we end up making ourselves dizzy in one-on-ones looking at their ERDs and how everything fits together. Also, hey, you know.
When you say it needs to be a joint table that has user submittable attributes, like the joint table, I guess I'm just a little confused when you say joint table. Do you mean like just like model?
Sorry, I'm not getting great audio from you, Sandy.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, go for it.
Okay. I was wondering what you when you said it must include a user submittable attribute. You mean that like this? Sorry, I think someone has their.
Got it. If you guys want to mute yourself just to be on the safe side, I think you guys are muted by default. Go for it, Sandy. Try one more time.
Sorry, I was saying the joint table. Can you just show me what you mean by that? Do you mean like the associations you were just talking about that has many?
So when we look at swimming and stuff, so when we look at our schema, what's the easiest way to identify a join model? Table? Well, this is more like a question for everybody versus like Like, I'm not
Go ahead,
grilling
Steve.
you, Sandy. Yeah, thanks, Sergey. You got 2 foreign keys, right? Because for me, in my case, workout exercises, they belong to an exercise, so they need a foreign key on that exercise, and they need a workout. So they have a foreign key for that, right? So what this requirement is saying is that your join model cannot just have those foreign keys, right? It has to have other attributes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Cool. Anything else on that one? No, we're good. Now, kind of in the same vein, so there's not a requirement that you have a nested form. Sometimes students think that that is the case for this project. It used to be a requirement, but it's not anymore. You may very well find that it makes sense in your project to have a nested form, right? And I would encourage you to have one, because if you're going to have a project sitting in your GitHub that shows your capacity as a Rails developer, you probably want to show that you know how to handle a nested form, right? They're not that hard. It's like variations on different, like a recipe, right? You follow the steps and you're good, right? And there's slight variations, right? So what you might find, since you're dealing with this form where you're making a join model, it might make sense to make an instance of that join model and one of its children or its parent, right? So it might make sense in your use case to do that, right? So this is a cheat sheet that I handed out to you guys a while back, and let's think about it in the context of doctors and patients and appointments, right? It might totally make sense in your application for you to make an appointment, and at the same time, you could like make a patient or select an existing patient, right? That totally is a reasonable use case. So in that case, if you're making the appointment and you're making, say, the patient, that nested item is the patient, right? Is that a parent of an appointment, or is it like a thing that an appointment has many of? Right, so if we think about our models, right? We got a doctor, we have an appointment, which has too many letters, so I'm abbreviating, and we have a patient, right? Which of these gets the foreign keys?
Appointment.
Yeah, so it's gonna have a doctor ID and it's gonna have a patient ID, right? So doctor and patient are like parents to it, right? So in this case, if you're making an instance of your join model, right, and you're nesting either the doctor or the patient, you're nesting the parent. So in that case, you're gonna be doing something like this use case here, right? Where everywhere you see item, right, this is the parent, right? So the association is singular because an appointment belongs to a doctor or an appointment belongs to a patient, whichever one you're nesting in the form, right? So everywhere you see item in here, you would write the name of the parent. So let's say we're making an appointment and a patient at the same time. This would be patient, right? You add that into your appointment model. It belongs to a patient, right? You would have accepts nested attributes for a patient, or you'd write a custom setter, right? And then you might want to reject anything that's not filled out because maybe they're not selecting a patient for whatever reason, right? You'd want to work in your strong params, right? Because you need to clear whatever values you're getting from that form, right? So if you want to have something like select from an existing patient, you would have patient ID being whitelisted, right? If you wanted to also be able to make new appointments, not appointments, patients in that same form, right? You would have patient attributes, right? In your fields for, right? Because it's 3 places you check. It's your model, it's your strong params, and your form, right? So now you would have fields for a patient, right? So we're just subbing in the name of the parent item, right? This part is optional. It usually doesn't matter, but it doesn't hurt to have it if you don't need it, right? That would be the parent, right? So it's not so bad. It's variations on a formula, right? Let's say for whatever reason you wanted to do the reverse. You could totally like make a doctor and a appointment at the same time, right? And have the appointment nested under doctor, right? Now you're working here, right? Now you have a doctor has many, this would be whatever we're nesting under. So this is appointments, right? You would have accepts nested attributes for appointments in that model. We're going to pretend I can spell, right? Now think about your strong params. It depends what you want to do. Do you want to you're probably not going to select from existing appointments. You're probably going to make a new one. But depending on whether you're doing one or the other or both, that's going to affect what you're doing in your strong params. If you wanted to select an existing one, this is going to be appointment IDs, right? If you want to just make new appointments, this is going to be appointments, I'm going to pretend I can spell, attributes, right? If you want to do both, you'd have both, right? For your fields 4, this is just going to be appointments. It's the name of the collection, right? And then this would be appointment, right? So it's just variations on the same theme, right? So what I'm trying to say in many words is that all of you are totally capable of doing a nested form. It's not that hard. It's just a matter of knowing what to do in the right places, right? It's not a requirement though, but it may make sense for many of you to have a nested form. I might have gone through that quickly. Are there questions about any of that? I guess mostly like understand that you don't have to do it, but I would encourage you to include a nested form. Okay. What they're not going to do is have you code a nested form on the fly. That sounds like a particular kind of torture. They're not going to do that to you. They're not going to expect you to do that. I mean, maybe if you have a form and it breaks, then now it turns into a debugging session, but you shouldn't anticipate that that's going to be your live coding, right? If that's your live coding, you tell me and I will find that person and fight them, right? That's not what you're going to have to do. What you should anticipate is that they're going to grill you on things like request response flow, which I've tried to nag into you guys. They want to see that you understand what the parts of your program are responsible for, right? So in many, many ways, Mod 2 and that Mod 2 project and assessment are to help transition you into Rails. So you'll probably find that a lot of the questions are pretty similar or they're emphasizing the same things, right? Because they're important ideas. We start you off with them early. So you should expect, like I did a Sinatra assessment this morning. I'm like really intense about this, but you should expect to talk through like every point in your application, right? So like if we're working with dogs and I type in the URL localhost 9393/dog/new, I want to know exactly what happens next, right? So I want to know that we're making a GET request. In the case of Rails, we're going to head over to our routes, and then either implicitly or explicitly, you're going to say something like, when they make a GET request to dog/new, take them to my dogs controller, specifically the new action, right? You want to be able to articulate those pieces, right? And then what happens next? I'm going to make a dummy dog so my form 4 can render, and then I'm going to render that view, right? And then what happens? You get a lovely form in the browser, user's going to fill it out. What happens when they click that submit button? I want to know, we're going to make a post request probably to /dogs, right? Because somewhere in your form, you've got instructions on what kind of request and where to make it when that form is submitted, right? In Mod 2, you had to write that yourself, right? Now you're working with Form 4, which is handling a lot of that for you, but you're expected to still understand like what the pieces are doing, right? So what do we say? We make a post request to /dogs. We're back in our routes, right? We've got something like when they say post to dogs, take them to my dogs controller, the create action, right? Then what happens? We're going to do some combination of maybe making dogs and associating them to other objects, right? So we're calling some active record methods that are going to run some SQL and save dogs to our database, right? Then we're going to redirect somewhere, right? Either the show or the index. But that is the biggest thing I look for in my Mod 2 assessment, and they're still looking for that in this assessment, right? And a lot of times, whatever they give you for your live coding is really not about that thing. It's seeing if you know where to look and what the different parts are responsible for, right? So they'll often give you something that inherently is not that hard, but it involves multiple parts of your application because they want to see, do you understand which stops to go to for which pieces, if that makes sense. What are my points? We'll come back to that. But like, it would be pretty typical for them to like have you walk through that step or do a live coding that is checking to see if you know where those pieces should be. Okay, cool. So that wasn't really a requirement. That was kind of a left-hand turn that's also important. Now, what else, right? You want to have reasonable validations, right? You don't have to go crazy and do every flavor of validation on every object that you have, right? What you do want to make sure is that if given the choice between a model validation, so an active record one, and a controller one, you're using a model level validation, right? So they want to see that you know to do that. It doesn't mean you can't validate anything in your controller, but if you have to choose between the two, you want to push it off to the model if it's related to an object, right? So that's what they're looking for on that level. But more importantly, like they're looking at your error message display and they're really looking for it to be structured in a particular fashion, right? A theme that we've stressed since the first project is like, assume that your users are going to do things wrong and you're responsible for telling them what they did wrong and like how to fix it, right? So in this case, you would think they would group them together, but alas, you need to display validation errors from your form, right? They're looking for a fields with errors class, which is easy enough to write, but within that field, you're displaying errors from your active record errors object, right? So when I got a bunch of stuff open. So when we looked at that together, this has some nested form stuff because it evolved from one thing to the next, but we were focusing on the user model, right? Writing some simple validations, like we have this silly custom one and we have things like presence. But most importantly, when we look in your controller, we're seeing that, hey, if something goes wrong and we can't save that object, you should be re-rendering the view because you get a lot of out-of-box behavior from your form for when you do that, right? It's going to give you by default a fields with errors, and then you can style that in whatever way that you want, right? So they're looking for that. Let me actually show you, where's this format? There we go. Who is pinging me? Just making sure that's not one of you guys. Okay, cool. If it's staff, they can wait. But yeah, they're looking for a little, I guess in this case, I didn't follow the directions because it should probably be a div, but they're looking for it to have an ID of error explanation, but then inside, you're just using that errors object from active record, right? So that's one thing that they're looking for. And then for the fields with errors, like if you re-render your form, Form 4 takes care of that for you. You can just target it with styling in a particular way. So like I showed you guys, I got this from Nancy. It probably could be better, but it gets the job done. You'll see when I run this, I think it's for users new, not you. Come on. Users. Sorry, I've been like in Sinatra mode for most of the morning, so I have to stop and think of where I'm going. But so we've got this form. It's pretty unassuming, but if I don't fill it out, if I don't follow the directions, right, I get some fields with errors that I can style in a particular way, right? And I get this little div that I made with my active record model errors, right? So I can see I've got that little UL with that ID on it. I could target that with styling if I wanted to. And then I get my little fields with errors somewhere in here. I'm in the children. There we go. Right? So it's not hard to build. You just want to make sure that that's present, right? And then if you wanted to go in addition to that and have like flashes for maybe success messages or authorization errors, you totally could do that as long as you are hitting this requirement for your model stuff, right? Are there any questions on that requirement, right? So reasonable validations on your models displayed in a particular way.
So the errors that they want, like this kind of flash message, like last time we had that, we enabled like a gem, not the flash, but this time they just want us to do the ones that come in with validations itself, like .error.
They are requiring that for validations related to objects, so things that you're creating through forms, you are using the errors that you're getting back from active record, or you can make your own custom errors, but they're expecting that you're using the model errors and you're displaying them in this case with your form by re-rendering the view, right? You totally could use flash messages, right? There's benefits of doing it one way versus the other, right? So in this case, I would say for like, if you wanted to tell the user like, hey, you successfully authenticated, that might be a good use case for a flash, right? Or like, hey, dummy, you can't edit user 4's recipe. Like that might be a good case for a flash message, right? Because it's not based on an object. It's based on something else, right? So you could totally use both, but they're just looking for this one. Cool. All right, all right. We're into that. Did I miss anything important? Right? If you're using Devise, Devise will handle a lot of the reasonable validations for the user, but if you're not, like you already know how to do that. You've done it a bunch. And then one thing I learned the hard way. When you're doing third-party login, or I guess let me rephrase it this way. When you're testing your app on like your kind of like, for lack of a better term, vanilla login, so like the one that you built yourself, don't use the email that you use for your third-party login, because then at least if you're using Devise, like I did this with Janae earlier, but you're gonna get an error saying that you can't have duplicate emails for your users, which is totally legit, but it's gonna be confusing and a little hard to debug. So learn from that. Talking about that, that's good. Missing somebody in the chat. Sorry, Thomas, let me look. To clarify the sign-in requirements, we don't have to use Devise, we can roll our own or use another security gem. Yep, the only requirement is that you must have user accounts. So you must have in some shape or form that a user can sign up, they can log in and log out. There is no requirement that it has to be through Devise or I think CanCan is another option. You just have to have it in some shape or form, right? But there's no requirement to use a particular gem or an outside gem, right? The only requirement is that it has validations on the user's password and that it has an OmniAuth. Yep, so as long as you have user accounts with reasonable validations and you're storing passwords securely, that hits it, and then you also need a third-party login. So, cool. Did that answer your question, Thomas? Or did that muddy it further? Cool, perfect. All right, so we're on there. Talked about user accounts. Oh, we actually hit that before I intended to. So while I'm on that point, while we're talking about third-party logins, I'm always going to encourage you to hit the requirement first and then go nuts, right? Because sometimes students will come into an assessment and their third-party login is broken and then they fail their assessment because that's a requirement. So even if like GitHub doesn't make sense for your like recipe app, right? It's easy to implement. So you can get that out of the way first, or you can do a Facebook, and then you can go crazy and have Twitter or Google or what have you, but get one working first. So if that's like, if I were to impart advice, get the easy one out of the way, and then you can go for like your dream one, right? I'm not trying to limit you. I just want to make sure you hit that requirement and like not have that be the reason why you don't meet your project expectations. Cool. So let's talk about this scope method requirement, which is somewhere in here. I'm all over the place. There we go, right in front of my face, number 4, right? So this is the one that tends to come out of left field, and then students usually react 2 ways. They're either angry that they're being asked to do something they didn't learn how to, or they ask me, they're like, did we learn how to do this? Or like, did I miss it? Like, where was it at, right? So for those of you who were with us in Mod 2, I tried to warn you when we started working with active record methods. Do I have this pulled up? I do, but also active record query methods. Query methods, right? You've seen a lot of what you need under the hood to like build a scope method. You've seen the active record query interface, right? Essentially, we're letting active record run some queries for us, whether it's some kind of search functionality or sorting or ordering, which I guess is a variation on sorting, right? So you've seen that context. You haven't really seen it like with this jargon and syntax of a scope method, right? So if you hit the link here, they take you to active record scopes. And what you should think of these as is like a little class method that you're building that has some kind of querying functionality, right? So the closest thing I can think of that you guys see in this mod is in that partial and locals lab, when we were working on this little query method, right? Where it's like a bunch of student names and you can type in the fragment of a name and it will give you all the lists of students that have that set of characters somewhere in their name, right? This is the same idea, just in a different syntax. You're building a little class method that is running some kind of active record query for you, right? They're just asking that you use, whoops, not you, where are we at? They want you to use their syntax, right? So this is basically saying, build me a class method called published on this article model, right? What it's going to do is it's going to return me kind of an array, but not technically an array, but it's going to give you an active record relation, but essentially it's a list of all of the articles where this condition is met, right? So every article has an attribute of published and it's either true or false. So we're kind of doing a filter where we're saying, get me all the ones that are published, right? They have published as true, right? So that's all it is kind of at a high level. It's something that you could build yourself, but they're asking you to do this like in a particular way with those query methods. So when they get at this point here, where is it at? They say your scope method must be chainable, right? Anyone know what that means?
You can like add methods on methods.
Yeah, so it has to do with that on one level, right? So you could totally, like in this case, they have two scope methods, right? They have a little class method that gives me all of the articles that are published, right? And then they have another little method here that gives me the ones that are both published. So they're calling this one here. Oh no, that's a thing you could do. Like it's calling that first one, and then we're making an additional query on top of it, right? So we're chaining in that way. This is a cool little resource I hadn't seen before. I stole this from Corinna, one of the other cohort leads. It actually does a nice job. Well, one, it tells you how to build these with arguments, which is pretty cool. And then two, the chainable part. So another thing that's cool / important about this chaining piece, right? When you chain these query methods, it's only going to execute one query, right? So it's not going to ping your database twice, right? So it's more efficient. So that's another thing that's important there. But like specifically for you guys, when they say must be chainable, they're making sure that you don't find a loophole, because you guys know how to build a lot of the same functionality with vanilla Ruby methods like sort or find all. So they're just being very clear, like, we're letting you know you need to use a query method to implement this, right? But it's actually kind of cool because there's a lot of ways that you can do that based on whatever your application does. So we talked about the article one. I know there are some articles that I've like shown you guys previously. While I'm here, like if you scroll just a little bit lower, they talk about passing in arguments. This is nice for if you want to kind of have your scope method respond differently to user inputs. So that would be a nice use case. Like here, we're using a user input. So I'm guessing I could probably just do something like this, right? Right? Memorizing things is overrated. You just have to know how to look, like where to find the things that you need, right? Even for your live coding, like when I do assessments, if I ask you to do a live coding and you pull up the active record query methods, like I'm impressed, I'm into it. You knew where to look to find whatever it is that you needed. Right? You just can't use like Stack Overflow or blog posts. But if you go to official docs, like they're thrilled, right? What was my point, right? We could probably do something like this, scope, search, and then this is what? This is coming from the user, right? So this is our query, and we want to say something like, I think we can just pop this in here. I think I lost a parenthesis somewhere in there, but like, it's the same idea as what you guys have seen. It's just a different like syntax, but you've totally seen how to do this before, right? Does that make sense? Kind of maybe. Cool. And And again, for some of you, I've like talked this to death with so many examples. But any kind of thing where you're sorting based on that, or like filtering based on a condition, like I think one example that comes up a lot is like shirts, like somewhere either in this document or like a blog post that comes up a lot, there's like, you've got a shirt model and let's say you want to get all of the blue shirts, right? That's an easy use case. If you want to think about something more complex, in my Rails project, which is somewhere floating in here, not you, not you, not you. There we go. Right. So I think it was in my exercise model. Models live here. Yes, in front of my face. Right. Right. So I had one that took in an argument. Right. So on my index view for exercises, right, there's a little form tag where a user can type in a muscle group, right? And then based on whatever they entered, I said, hey, get me all of those exercises that hit that muscle group, right? And then you see this right here? I'm pretty sure that this was my live coding. It's really common, but not guaranteed that your live coding could be to build a scope method because it tests a lot of things at once because you have to know where to define it. It goes in your model, right? Where are you going to use it? It could be in a view, but more commonly it's going to be in a controller action, right? And then it makes you Google things because you probably we're not, you probably don't have that memorized. You're not writing scope methods every single day, right? So they want to see that you can go out and find something that you don't know how to do off the top of your head. My scope muscle group is chainable. Let me see. I think so. Because it's using aware, I would imagine. What was my point? Where are we at on time? So I think one thing, okay, got it. You'll see I'm like a goldfish. I was on to something. So if we were to do, right, let me just make a new one real fast. Right. So depending on what your app looks like, it might be a feature that makes sense on your application, like they'll lean towards that, but if not, they might make a kind of a silly use case just to see if you can do all of those pieces, right? So if we think about let's say I have an application that's letting the user keep track of shirts of various colors, right? Your live coding could very well be something like build a new route for me that looks like shirts blue, right? And all it does is it specifically shows me all of the shirts that are blue, right? And they might specify it has to be a separate view, right? What are the pieces that you would have to build that functionality? What would you need to do? Right. So I want to build a scope method that specifically lets me query for all of the blue shirts. And I'm specifically asked that that should be displayed in a new view that I get at with this route. Okay. There's a few different things that I would have to do. Probably should have numbered them, but give me one thing. There's not one right order, but they're looking that you know where to go for the various pieces.
First in the config file, you have to add between the routes, like the root routes.
You would totally, well, not the root route, but you'd need to build a route. So whether you did it, well, I guess you'd have to do it explicitly here. So you'd have to, they'd want to see that you know to go to your routes, right? And then you're going to have something like get shirts blue to some other place. So presumably you have a shirts controller and you're going to take them to an action called blue. We're going to assume that everything is mirroring that name, right? So now you've got a route. What else do you need?
You're gonna need an action for it.
Yeah, you're gonna need an action. So you're gonna go into that controller, right? And then you're gonna have something like def blue, right? That'll make your life easier because then you're probably gonna need a view that mirrors that, right? So you're gonna need a view. right? We're gonna call it blue, right? Again, it's a silly example, but we have to hit all the points. Now, we still have a couple pieces that are missing. What else do we need?
You need to go into the shirt model and make the scope method.
Yep, right? So it's not really about the scope method, but it's seeing if you know how to connect all the other pieces. But in your model, right, you're gonna have class shirt, it's gonna have some lovely validation somewhere in there. Maybe you have some nice little helper methods so that your controllers stay nice and lean. But you're also gonna have something like def, oh wait, you're not gonna do it this way. You're gonna use the right syntax. So it's gonna be scope, and then we're calling it blue, right? That's the name of our class method, right? And then I think they have you use this funky syntax, which again, you don't have to memorize. You don't get extra points for doing that. You're gonna do something along these lines. There we go, right? And then what do we wanna actually say here? Let's assume that our shirts have a color attribute of whatever color they are.
Where shirts is blue?
You're on the right track. Does a shirt
Color blue.
Yeah. What am I saying here? So it's a string and it's got a color, right? So now you've got, I was expecting this to look a little bit nicer. Thanks for bearing with me. But we've got a scope method, right? We're still not done, right? I've had the model level. I know how to get all of the shirts that are blue. I have a route, right? I have a route that takes me to a particular action. Currently that action does nothing. Well, it will render a view called blue. That's all it does so far. What else do we need to do if we want to display all of the blue shirts?
Don't you have to put the logic in the controller?
Yeah, you need to like you have this lovely little, this lovely little method that you built that does a thing, but it's not going to do anything for you until you call the method, right? So then you can say something like, I mean, you can call it shirts, you can call it blue shirts, you can call it banana, but make it descriptive, right? So we're gonna call it shirts, right? And call your little method, right? You may, that's not what you called it. It's always fun when that happens. The best typo in Ask the Question is, I have a remarkable talent for writing ass instead of add. And I have to say the word add a lot. But we're going to call our little method, right? That's going to get us all the blue shirts, right? And then from there, we're just iterating over a collection. So in our view, we're doing something like any other index view where we're saying, iterate over all of my shirts and display the stuff for each one, right? But does that make sense that like, it's not a hard task, but it's seeing if you understand what each piece does and how they fit together, right? So for that reason, it's a fairly common live coding. And there's not one right way to do it. They could have you customize an existing view. So like what I did with my little search form, or they could have you build a totally separate view. But they're not necessarily looking like, can you bang it all out in 2 minutes? That's not the point. It's like, do you understand the pieces? Can you communicate your thought process? That's what they're looking for. Can you show competency in request response flow in the parts of your application? Okay.
So this is chainable because then you can create like another scoped method maybe that looks for like specific sizes in blue shirts.
Yeah.
And okay.
So you could have a little
Login.
scope method called blue and a method called, I don't know, crew neck. Or like maybe it's crew neck question mark and it returns true if it's a crew neck, or like maybe it's based on size. But yeah, you could totally chain them and then it's going to make the one query versus hitting your database twice.
Okay.
Cool. Good question.
Makes sense.
Are there questions on that
When
requirement?
you say query, that's the request that goes into your database.
Yes. Or sometimes I'll say ping your database, but it's the same thing. SQL is being run to get a thing from your database or a collection of things. Cool. So that we're good. We hit the scope one. That's the one that tends to come out of the blue. I'll make sure to share this with you guys because I haven't shared it before. The next requirement is on the nested resource, right? Some students think that this means, again, they have to have a nested form. That's not a requirement. They're just looking at how your routes are nested, right? So the requirement is that you must have either or of a nested index or a nested show, right? So if I'm keeping track of like user books and reviews, I might have something like, let me go back so I can illustrate. we're just doing all of the Ruby in this file and pretending it makes sense together. But you might have something like books, reviews, what do we want? A nested index? Books, 1, reviews, right? That's a nested index because I'm seeing all of the reviews for a particular book, right? Or you can have a nested show. I want to see review 10 for book number 1. That's a nested index, right? You can have both, but they're just looking for one or the other. But they also want to see that you have a nested new. So they want to see that that view is nested, not necessarily that the form is nested, right? Like within the form, right? But you could do a nested form. So they would also want something like, I want to be able to make a new review for book number 1, right? So that's the requirement. Now, depending on how many models you're working with, you may or may not have to nest the user, right? Why do we generally nest resources? What is the benefit of doing that, right? Other than making URLs that reflect object relationships, which is a nice consequence, but it's not really the reason that we do it. Why is it helpful to have a URL that's keeping track of the book when we make a new review?
We know the parent to keep track of.
We know the parent, we're keeping track of it, and we don't have to put that on the user to tell us when they're making a new review, like pick the book. We could do that, but now we don't have to because we're keeping track of that piece. So you may find that if you're only working with 3 models, it might be a necessity for you to nest your resource under user, right? Now, it's not the end of the world if you have to do that, but the view of the team is kind of like, one, it's redundant because you don't need to keep track of the user in that way. You're going to have a helper called current user that you either build yourself or Devise is going to build for you, right? So you don't get that benefit. Now, the other drawback is that you may or may not want something like, let's see, user 1 accounts, something like this. Like, let's say we're keeping track of bank accounts. Accounts show, I don't know. We're seeing one at a time, right? Depending on your application, it may or may not make sense to expose the ID of the user in your URL, right? Because you may not want the user to get curious and say like, I can see my account, what's the account of user number 10 look like, right? So all of that is to say that if you do have to nest under user, be prepared to defend it. And it's okay to say like, it doesn't really make sense to do this for my application, but I'm doing it to hit a requirement. They'll take that as an answer because they know if you have 3 models, you're probably going to have to do that to hit that requirement. So if you can say like, I wouldn't do it for this reason, but I'm doing it because I have to hit it, they're all over it. They're into it. But just make sure that if you are doing that and you don't want a user to see somebody else's stuff, that you're protecting against that in some way. Right? Questions on that requirement? No. And then what else while I'm here? This was for nested routes. A gentle reminder to never do it as deeply nested as I did here, right? That was for exaggeration, for dramatic effect. You should never nest more than a level deep. When you are working with your nested stuff, right? Another little reminder, when you look at your routes, Rails, routes, I don't even know what I'm G-ripping, we'll see. Right? When you build those helpers, just be mindful of which helpers will need to have multiple objects passed to them. Oh no. Okay, cool, right? So whenever you're seeing some kind of, oh, I'm not in the right application, genius. Nested, I think it was this guy. Cool. Right? So whenever you're seeing, like I've got, what's a good example? Let me pull this over. So I'm making, I just saw it. You think I have enough examples looking at all these nested routes, right? So I've got an author ID here and a book ID here. Whenever I call that helper method, whenever I call new author book review, I have to give it the author and the book, so Rails knows what to fill in for those IDs, right? That's one thing that sometimes turns students around. And then when you're working with your, I just missed it. Oh, you can use two commands in Rails to define the ID to another attribute, like username, and it'll automatically do it everywhere. Use two commands. Do it everywhere, just make sure. I'm not sure, Thomas, because I'm not sure when you came back in, but we, I think, have most recently been talking about helpers for the nested routes. Yes, the sure. Oh, yeah. When we were talking about like, so a super common live coding exercise is to have you build a scope method and then implement it in some kind of feature. So with the shirt thing, this is kind of a silly example, but it's something that they could do. They're just going to tweak it to whatever your application does. So they might say like, build me a little scope method that returns all of the blue shirts, and then like fill in the functionality so that I get that displayed to me in a new view, right? So build a new view that specifically shows me all of the blue shirts, because they want to see, do you know that there's a particular thing to do in your routes? Do you know to build an action, right? It's an easy way to check if you understand implicit rendering in Rails. They're going to know that you need a view, and they're also looking for the model method, but more importantly, once you define it, do you know that you have to call it in a controller action, right? So just hitting up a few different pieces with that requirement. Okay. And then back to the nested stuff. The only other point I had is when you're working with your, not that kind of nested form, but with your form that's in a nested route, right? Remember that you have this syntax where you can pass both the parent and the child object so that it knows how to structure some other stuff in the form correctly. So for example, it needs to know like the correct route to post to. Cool. There's that. I think I hit all the important stuff. The other stuff I was going to mention is usually not stuff students have a problem with. Let me make sure. So like if you guys show up and you're not using Ruby on Rails, I'm concerned. Like I'm not worried that you guys are not going to know about that requirement. That's easy. We talked about this. When they say like you don't have to go crazy on this requirement, you want to be reasonable, but like as you're building your application or as you're getting towards the end, take a step back and think about like, where am I repeating myself? Might it make sense to use a partial? Might it make sense to like I've got this, I hate this term, I've got a fat controller. Like, does it make sense for me to maybe build a little model method and then call that method in my controller, right? So they're looking to see that you are, yes, for sure. Don't do it in assembly. But yeah, they're looking to see that you're being reasonable, right? So at a minimum, I would say you should be using partials for your forms because they're going to be generally identical except for like the title and the button, right? And then if you see other places where you can do that, like go for it. There's a little article I wanted to share with you guys. I actually didn't know this was a thing. I probably should have known. I think they link you to something similar in the curriculum, but you can actually use partials to render your collections. So like when you're iterating, you can use this little collection flag and then pass it the name of your collection. And then if you have like, so in this case, I have a little partial for an individual project, but maybe I'm in an index view and I have a collection of projects or products I want to render, right? I can use that key and it will render the partial for each item in my collection, right? So all I have to do in my index view is this. And then this is my little partial, right? It's just gonna be whatever an individual like product looks like. So it's a nice little thing that you could do. It's not a requirement, but since it's on topic, I figured I would bring that part up. Right. Any questions on the requirements first? I think I hit all the big things in many words, right? The last thing, so that I don't forget myself. They give you some examples. These are okay to use. Your project can be variations on those. You cannot do anything like amusement park, right? That's the heavy duty lab that comes up at the end of the section, right? So you can't use that domain because they basically taught you exactly how to do that. I've had a couple conversations with some of you about the blog stuff. It might make sense for you to have an app that's like a variation on a blog theme, but what this is saying is that like, if you're going to do a blog app, it needs to be obvious that you're just not doing it the way that you were taught in a lab, right? It needs to like be steps beyond that. So it should kind of like be really well built, have functionality that you didn't just pull from a lab, right? But those are the restricted domains. Some of this stuff is like super obvious. Make sure you have, like at this point, you should have a well-written README. It shouldn't just be present, it should look good, right? So think of your README, like me as an assessor, when I give feedback to students, I tell them that their video walkthrough, their blog post, and their README determine if I'm interested in looking at their code. Not as an assessor, because like I have to do it anyway, but like think of it as little ways to advertise yourself to, say, a recruiter, right? Or someone who might want to work with you and like expand on your code base, right? So your README should give like a clearly written introduction to like what your app is about, what problem does it solve, what's its functionality, and then it should give instructions on how to install it and run it, right? How to contribute to it, and then something like a license, right? Those should be there. You wanna, I feel like I shouldn't have to say this, but you wanna like check for typos and things, right? Because like that's a representation of your project, right? If that doesn't look good, like why, like your attention to detail, like if I see that it's not there, like could it also translate to your code, right? So that you want to look good. As far as your video walkthrough, I tend to tell students like don't treat that as a big intense technical walkthrough, right? For the beginner, like the first two projects, I say 3 to 5 minutes. It can be a little longer for later projects, but really what that project is meant to do is show a user how to use your application. So literally how to use it and what it does, right? That's not the place or the time where you have to talk through what all of your code is doing. That's not what that's for. That's generating interest so that when you write your resume, you can link your walkthroughs and a recruiter can look at that and determine like, that looks pretty good. Let me look at the code base if they have like the experience to do that. Like they might send it off to someone else who has more experience with code, right? If you want to get technical, I would encourage you to do that in your blog post, right? What I find, and again, like take it for what it is, because the first two projects tend to not be as strong as later projects because you're still learning how to do things, but try not to treat your project blog post as simply an avenue to reflect or vent. Because for many students, it's just kind of like something they put together at the last minute. There's some variation on like, it was really hard and I didn't know how to start, but then I figured it out and I learned a lot, right? There tend to be those pieces, but not a lot of substance in between. So what I know, but it's important. The whole reason that you guys are writing blog posts, or I guess it's a few different reasons. It's to help you stand out, right? To show that like you're interested in talking about code, you're competent at it, right? It's demonstrating your technical ability. Can you talk about coding concepts, right? So what I tell students, like when I give them feedback on their assessments, I want to know what your app does. So it should communicate key features. So don't just say, I built a recipe app. It was hard. I learned a lot, period. Like tell me what your project does, communicate enthusiasm, right? Because no one wants to hire you if it seems like every time you have to build something, you're like being tortured slowly, right? So it's totally okay to say something like it was hard, but then leave it on a positive note, because sometimes it comes off as complaining for some students. Not that I've seen that in you guys, but I've seen it in students. So always end positive, right? But then probably most importantly, right? Take something that you learned while building that project and talk about it, right? If you spent 4 days getting Google OAuth to work, I want to see that in your blog post, right? For me, I think about your blog post, like your main audience is a recruiter, and then your secondary audience is like, it could be other coders. They want to learn stuff what you learned the hard way, like you're making it a little bit easier for someone who tries to do this same thing later on, right? So those are the kinds of things that I like to see in a blog post, in addition to the usual, like it should be coherent and not full of typos and things of that nature, right? So that's what I'm looking for. It doesn't have to be 10 pages long, but like it should be more than 2 paragraphs about how like it was hard, but you had fun and figured it out. Like it's got to be more substance is what we're looking for, right? I think those are all the pieces from me. My only last thing, and I stole this from Nancy, but so Rails Amusement Park is a tough lab. I would encourage you, if you have the bandwidth and time to like attempt it, please do, because it's got a lot of like cool features that you might like to also use in your project. It's a challenging lab. Many of the tests are very nitpicky and don't necessarily make the most sense. But if you get it working in the browser, right, even if you have a few tests that aren't passing, it's okay to say like, I got the important stuff, it's working, because that's your source of truth, right? And then move on, right? So I would encourage you to attempt it. Don't spend a week of project mode doing that lab, right? You have to also do your project, but try to find a balance, because it is like worthwhile if you have the bandwidth for it. It's not required, your project is required, so you'll find whatever that balance is for you. And then a pro tip is that like it's got a really nice nav bar. Many students will steal the nav bar and the styling on it for their projects. Okay, I think that is my prepared spiel. I'm happy to take any additional questions, clarifications, reflections, things of that nature. What do you got?
Sorry, you can go first. You can go first.
Just really quickly, for me, I think my biggest issue right now, because I haven't gotten through it, is just understanding scope. And so I know you're showing with the deaf blue at shirts and that sort, but could you just explain again the point of it and why it's important to incorporate into this project?
The first part is easier to answer than the second. Why it's important, why they have it as a requirement, to show that you're able to do it, because it's probably like querying is fairly common when you're building projects, right? So maybe it's just to show that you can do that. But I mean, what it is ultimately, right? It's letting you use queries, right? So active record methods that will run SQL for you, right? That you can use as method calls, right? So it's giving you functionality, right? You could, this is another example I like to use. If you have an application that keeps track of like donations that users make to various causes, it might totally make sense and be a cool feature for your app to have a separate view for like the heavy hitters. When you sum up all the donations that like, I don't know how to phrase this, but like when you take a user individually and like sum up all of the donations they've made and you compare that for all of your users, it might totally make sense to list them in descending order and grab like the top 10, right? They get their own view because they've donated the most, right? So ultimately it's like anything else, it's adding functionality to your app, Sandy. But in this case, they're looking for you to do it in a particular way. Cool. Cool. And then I think, Trisha, you were also having a question?
Yeah, it's kind of a little something different though. It's more about my environment.
Got it.
I updated my application stuff. I don't know. And so like, I don't know if anybody had any issue with this configuring I-18N. Have you seen that before? I
don't actually know what that means.
Yeah, I don't know. It's something, and I don't know where to find it. And so I can't run my application because of that.
Okay. Okay, so then what you are going to want to do is to book a time with me as soon as possible so we can kind of poke around and go from there. Because, I mean, based on what you're telling me, I don't know, but I have to like look at it and poke around and see. So this actually brings me to my next point. Like for those of you, I would assume everyone, but because in theory, all the cohorts should run the same. But starting Monday, so all of next week and then the following week, we're on a different schedule, right? So we're not like, if I have one-on-ones with you or pod meetings, like we're not on that schedule, we won't meet at those times. You will still be able to book time with me. So I'll share this tomorrow, but like you'll have a link that you can use to book time with me, and we'll have, I want to show you guys this maybe, right? So this isn't going to follow like the same schedule as it has in previous months. This won't work, but basically every single day next week and the following week, we'll have office hours at some time. It just won't be as rigid a pattern as in previous mods. So all of next week, that's 10 hours where you guys can like come to office hours and get help, but you also have slots that you can book with me one-on-one. So yes, that was a way of giving you that reminder, but also saying, Trisha, book time with me as soon as you can. Okay?
Okay. Yeah, I found the documentation on it. I'm gonna probably still try to go through it, but it's just confusing. I don't know.
Yeah,
So,
for sure,
yeah.
for sure.
Okay.
And then while it's on my brain, two heads up. So not this Monday, but the following Monday. So the second project week, is Labor Day. So Flatiron is closed. I will still be working because like you guys need project support, and like, what am I going to go out and do on Labor Day during a pandemic? But so like business will be running for us as usual as far as project support. But if you are working on labs, Ask a Question will be closed. So I think I just told Sandy this, but the very last Friday, so the 11th, I will be out of office. My sister is getting married the next day, so I won't be working that day. I also somehow got roped into being a matron of honor. That's a different story. It's not my favorite job, but I won't be working that day. But I will have to, like, I have extra slots open to help make up for that. And then we'll also, why this won't work when you guys are on with me for whatever reason, but there will be an office hours that Sunday and that Monday to help kind of cushion that a little bit. So you guys, I mean, you guys will still do this panicking with me on Sunday night, but there will be support, but I'm just giving you guys a heads up as what's coming. Okay. That was the last point I had. Last call for questions, concerns, bad jokes. No, we're good. So in that case, I'm going to end this meeting, and then Dina, I'm meeting with you. I'm going to make a new call because sometimes Zoom is weird when I stop the recording but stay in the meeting.
Okay.
So I'll end this call and I'll see you in like 2 minutes.
Sounds good.
All right. You guys have a great night.
Thank you.
All right,
You're
thank you.
welcome. Bye.
Bye.